Hi, everyone. This is yet another debate discussion. We took a break from the last debate, which was nice. I mean, I enjoyed not having to talk about it, to be honest. But last night I did watch, and I know, Richard, you watched as well. So we're going to talk about the debate. This is going to be really casual. Nothing was, pre-planned or whatever. But I do want to get your thoughts and all of that. But before we do that, how's everything going?
I guess, still kicking, so that's always a plus in my book. And I don't know. I've been running a bunch of emotions just since the debate and prior to the debate and all that stuff. And so I guess just generally I had to spend some time with some friends, and that was nice. So, and got some more friend time coming up. So people that I haven't been able to make time to be able to see in a while, I'm going to be able to see, and like family stuff and do that thing. So that's good news for me. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah. And also we didn't talk until, well, this is our first recording of the new year, right?
It is.
I think, yeah, because we had a bunch of like December recordings. I feel like December was like a whirlwind. I think we put out 4 podcasts in December, which is like a record for us because usually, especially lately, like coming back on the post hiatus schedule, it's been hard to do at that many recordings. I know that's the regular for some people's podcasts, but they have like whole crews and aren't doing like as much work in the same way. That's like their only job, to do podcasts. So it's much easier for them to just put out a podcast a week or more in some cases. But in our case, we've got jobs, day jobs, night jobs, weekend jobs, other stuff going on. So it can be difficult. But on that note, I wanted to, first of all, give a huge thank you to all of our new patrons and old patrons actually who've hung on and like been on board with us this whole time. And also a big, big, big thank you to people who've been promoting LeftPOC. I feel like we've gotten a lot of new people on Twitter following us and social media in general. And we've been getting a lot of really nice shout outs, which I appreciate. And that's something obviously that anyone can do. It doesn't cost any money. But even then, if you do have $1 or more, we appreciate it going to our Patreon, and that's patreon.com/leftpoc. I need to update the form, or not the form, but the release document that I put out about where our money goes, just to give a few more details. But just as an FYI, like all of our money goes back into this podcast. So we pay our guests. We also make a donation in the honor of our guests for the organization of their choice. And we have an assistant named Ariadna, who's amazing. We pay her for all of her hard work. Right now she's been doing transcripts like crazy. So we really appreciate that. And she does a little, sometimes I give her these like weird projects from like research this person or like look this stuff up. But she's always super responsive and amazing. And I want to get her on the show too. I've been very bad about that, but one day you all will meet Ariadna via the podcast, and she can talk about her politics and where she stands, because she's also, of course, a very ardent leftist, and she's great. And then, so in addition to that, we also pay for web storage and site storage and things like that, and of course taxes, because unfortunately, Patreon funding is taxed, even though we don't make a ton of it. We do have to pay Uncle Sam so they can use it to like go kill people in other countries. So that unfortunately is the fate that we have to deal with our taxes. But hopefully in the future, our taxes can start going to things that benefit the poor and the people who need assistance and healthcare and all these things. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other place that the funding goes, obviously, is back to other podcasts. So at LeftPOC, we support several other leftist podcasts whom we feel are doing like really amazing work and activist work as well. And so, yeah, basically, and I forgot, Richard gets paid also for his work. Richard is not up here working for free. Richard also gets a cut.
I'm immensely grateful for, by the way, just to sneak that in and continue.
Yeah, no, but it's like, I know it sounds silly, but it's important. Like these things are important to, first of all, lay out, I think, just for the sake of transparency, because a lot of podcasts are making bank and there's no transparency as to where their money goes, but usually it goes to like beer and Coke and whatever else, which is fine. Like they spend their money how they want to spend their money. But here at LeftPOC, we really believe in like giving back to the community, and not just with our podcast itself, but also, through the funding that we get. I have not gotten any money from LeftPOC yet, but I would like to get to the point where I can receive a little bump. But we, again, I think just on principle, the purposes of the podcast have to do with the community and thinking about, leftists of color and that history and whatnot. And so off the jump, I knew that I wanted the model of the financing model of the podcast to reflect a lot of the thoughts that the people we read about and talk about have. So again, thank you all so much. Anyone who's made a donation up to this point, we appreciate it. Even if you haven't been able to stay on with us, we still appreciate what you were able to contribute. And of course, we appreciate those of you who may not have the finances to donate, but who've definitely done your part in terms of sharing and liking the podcast, telling other people about the project as a whole, and also leaving us reviews on iTunes and whatnot. So again, thank you all so much. In terms of how I'm doing, I did put an announcement about this on the LeftPOC page for those of you who may not follow my personal account, which is @MuseWendy on Twitter, that I am super pregnant and have a baby popping out any minute now. She's set to come towards the end of February, just because I unfortunately have to have a C-section, but no diss to C-section babies or mothers who have to have C-sections, but just like, it's kind of crappy because they cut you open like you're a magician's assistant to get the baby out. So that's that. But in general, we're looking at around February 20th, somewhere around there. So I've kind of been working on a contingency plan. I've not been the best at it because it's hard for me to even stay awake some days, because I've been dealing with fatigue and whatnot. But I do want to have, like a backup plan in place. So y'all may not hear from me that much in the coming months. We'll see. But I definitely know that, Ariadna and Richard are going to try to hold down the fort while I'm gone. Because, babies are unpredictable, and unfortunately it's hard to conduct interviews when you have a baby who needs to be changed and fed and who's crying and, God knows what else. So, just giving y'all a heads up, if you don't hear from me, after the end of February for a few months, that's what's going on. I'm raising my daughter. You know how that works. Anyway, that's enough from me. And, I want to get into this debate. So we're going to talk about the Warren Bernie drama and whatnot later on, but I just wanted to start by saying that for me personally, I was actually surprised that CNN of all channels decided to focus quite a bit last night on foreign policy and environment. I wouldn't necessarily say that their framing was great, the foreign policy questions or the energy questions. And it's funny because in the beginning when I started watching it, and by the way, I was on drugs when I was watching it, not the fun kind of drugs, which I've never taken, but I was on antihistamines because I've been having I don't know, my body's attacking itself. So anyway, that's been fun. So I was like half asleep, drugged up, kind of drowsy and trying my best to pay attention. And what I did notice in the beginning is they were asking, I think, important questions about foreign policy, which, again, from CNN was a shock. And we can talk about some of the problems with the answers in a minute. But then it got progressively more ridiculous with time, including some of the foreign policy questions. So I don't know. What did you think about that opening round of questions, Richard?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to see CNN kind of where they decided to focus, including everything. And you mentioned the drama as well, but particularly in the foreign policy, they took good 30, 45 minutes of the opening to talk about it. And yeah, so the framing was generally problematic. And one of the aspects that a lot of people have pointed out is that although in the following debate about healthcare, the cost was constantly brought up, the cost of the never-ending wars was not really a focus of any of that 45-minute discussion, which seems remarkable with such time attributed towards it. That's one of the first things that kind of stuck out to me.
Right.
I guess like a lot, kind of a theme of the entire debate that definitely dominated foreign policy, but went also into various other topics, was essentially, as president, how would you control other countries around the world and make them do what you want?
Yep.
And it was just a really strange framing. It felt, it was very, I don't know, neo-imperialist in general, hawkish, and disconcerting in those ways. So there was that really stuck out to me. And towards the middle of the debate, it did seem to get very, I don't know, in the weeds, I guess. And one of the things, I guess, one more thing that stuck out to me was just for 45 minutes focused on foreign policy, from my perspective, being skeptical that Bernie Sanders wouldn't step in it several times during that discussion. He did it less than I expected, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, he had one moment where, well, so, okay, again, it's one of those situations where he's the best of the worst. You know what I'm saying? So like the bar is pretty low in terms of our expectations, just because like I know I'm personally coming from this from like way left of anyone on that stage, and I'm sure you are too. But it was, I agree with you in terms of the framing. A lot of it was about like, what can America's hegemony and dominance in the world, like how are you going to address that as president? Well, I guess, like how will you maintain that system?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that reflects a lot of the ways that, Americans are taught, US Americans are taught to think about the rest of the world. And one of the things that came out like over the past couple of weeks when everything was going down with Iran was that scary, scary, scary map of like where average Americans thought Iran was. And first of all, I just want to say for international listeners, like we don't get any geography instruction in the United States. And I think that's intentional. We don't learn about geography. And the only times we kind of learn about geography is through history classes, like in elementary and high school. And even then, the history classes are almost entirely focused around US conflict with the rest of the world. Like we spend a lot of, and conflict in general. So we spend a lot of time in the Civil War. We spend a lot of time on World War II. And then we kind of like stop at Vietnam. Most American history classes like don't even go past the 60s or 70s. There's not really any contemporary history instruction unless you opt to take those kinds of classes later on in life. So we don't get any geography instruction. So it wasn't so scary to me that they didn't know where it was. But I think what was scary was the ones who thought it was in the United States, which was like, what in the actual hell? How do you think that Iran is in the United States? And then furthermore, I think it sort of reflects this idea of, maybe why Americans were expressing a sense of violation over what they perceived Soleimani to have done. So like, everyone keeps saying like, oh, he was such a huge, or not everyone, but the government kept saying, oh, he posed a major threat to the United States. He posed a major threat to US soldiers, blah, blah, blah. But like, if you think that Iran is in the United States, then I can understand why you would believe that. But the issue is that Iran is another country. It's a sovereign country, and Iraq is as well. In Iraq in particular, we have invaded and stayed there. And we, started off our relationship with Iran through very contentious means in the 50s and kept going that direction, And so like this idea that that America has a right to be there and stay there indefinitely and to never be seen as an occupying army by people in the region, which is what they are. It's kind of, I think that like this idea that people think it's in the United States shows why they would think that these people on the Iranian side, like in their military, pose a threat to us. You know what I mean? Like we are the threat. Mm-hmm. We are the invaders. We are the occupying army. And it's crazy to me that people are still saying things like, he was threatening US soldiers, but US soldiers are the enemy. Like, just think objectively about this, like I want to shake people sometimes because I'm like, the US invaded under false pretenses and has like obviously before then engaged in coups and violence and all sorts of stuff against the Iranian people and Iraqi people. And like, I mean, it's just shocking to me that there's any semblance of, but there's any fraction of a belief that what's happening to US soldiers is not, I don't know. It's like, it's not justified because it is justified. I mean, imagine if someone invaded your home and attacked you. And, I gave the analogy of like someone throws a rock into your house through your window and it kills your dog and your child, and you're left there. And the person says, now I want you to pay for this thing that I did. And then on top of that, like anyone else in your house, they continue to injure. And then like once you've gotten kind of close to repairing the window, they break other windows that kill other people that continue to do harm. And then they like light your house on fire and then tell you you have to pay for it. And, oh, it's your fault that this happened. Like that's what is happening, but in terms of like our global policy. And, I don't know what to do to get people to understand that the US is the bad guy here. And oftentimes it's the bad guy. And I think that the questioning last night did not properly reflect that reality. And one thing I'm going to say, then I will shut up. I think that the one area where that was very, very clear was when Bernie Sanders was giving a decent answer in response to like why, the US needs to stop messing with everybody and whatever. But then he said at the end of one of his responses that America will do everything within its power or something like that to make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. And I just thought to myself, okay, first of all, the Iran deal, when it was written up, it was on the back of like a ton of sanctions and threats that were already made by the US to Iran. So it wasn't an agreement that was being made on fair terms, first of all. Second of all, so that's like my problem with the Iran deal as a whole. But then even if we look at the Iran deal positively, the US is the one who kept threatening them. And the US is the one who eventually pulled out. And so now like European countries are coming together to like basically sanction Iran and do all this stuff about, Iran pulling out of the deal prematurely and whatnot. And I'm like, the US is the one who pulled out of the deal first. Oh, like Trump broke down the deal, and including, some Democrats had been pushing against the deal for many, many years, including Clinton, who now likes to take credit for what she did. But she didn't have that much of a hand in the Iran deal, with the exception of, like I said, threatening Iran regularly to come, quote unquote, come to the table. But that kind of language to me is really, it's threatening in a lot of ways, because I'm like, after everything that's happened, Iran has every right, if they want, to like build as many nuclear weapons as they'd like, because they are being threatened on a regular basis by this country. And I don't agree with nuclear proliferation. I don't want anyone to have weapons. But I think it's ridiculous that we can say it's okay for Israel to have a weapon, or, massive nuclear weapons, or the US to have these weapons, or parts of Europe to have these weapons. But then these brown and black countries can't have any weapons because they wouldn't, it's like the sort of imperial mindset there. These are savages who wouldn't know how to restrain themselves from using violence on the rest of the world. When in actuality, the US and Europe has been actively engaging in violence towards the rest of the world.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with all the points you raised there, particularly the ones that stood out to me as well, both when you made them and during the debate, was also previously to debate the where's Iran issue and how that impacts people's perceived threat. Like, I mean, besides the ones that put it in the United States, which I'm hoping a large majority of them just had no clue and just went with that rather than, but like there's also another smaller map that was limited more towards Europe and the Middle Eastern region, and that one was just as bad, with like only a couple more % of people actually landing somewhere in Iran. And so with Iran and Iraq in general, that was also a similar situation. And so the disconnect between the humanity of the populations of these places that are being terrorized by U.S. foreign policy and like the perceptions of that we're actually bringing democracy and freedom to them is critical. And the fact that they're such a disconnect from where they are just geographically, it leads me to believe that the perceptions of what kind of impacts we're having in these nations or in these regions is perceived among the same people, and the justifications as well. So I do think that's a critical point. And so obviously advocate of critical pedagogy, and why that's also important to engage with to have a better understanding of the world around us, so that when we engage in conflicts around the world, we're not engaging in them haphazardly and ignorantly, even whether they're justified or not, or any of those types of things. Like, then we can actually discuss those in terms and with questions and in debates that are structured around a framing that is representative of things like one of the other points that you mentioned, which is that the U.S. is the irrational rogue state provoking other nations, leaders, and populations around the world. And one of the issues that I think people are having is, if I say Donald Trump is an irrational rogue actor provoking nations, leaders, and populations around the world, they're like, yeah, I agree with it. I can get a bunch of liberals to sign on to that. But if I tell them that the U.S. has been doing that for decades, even during the Obama administration, then it becomes, oh, well, you're just as bad as Trump. And it's like, well, wait, how did that happen?
Right.
And to me, that is kind of at the crux of a lot of the issue. And I think that's an important aspect that gets glossed over by the types of framing that CNN was using, that wasn't even just particularly anti-Bernie Sanders or anything, which was another framing issue that comes later, but like issues about, as you mentioned and we've discussed thus far, about the general framing of the U.S. as an actor on the world stage and what that means when other people react. Like, for instance, when Sanders said specifically that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, I agree with you fully that I don't want anybody to have nuclear weapons. But the idea that the United States stands as an arbiter of who gets to have them or not is ridiculous on several different levels. And it doesn't bode well with me to have Sanders, the least worst, or however we want to frame that, taking that kind of imperialist position. And so like that concerns me generally. And then also, if there's not critical engagement, I've seen, depending on the context and the circumstance, I've seen various levels of critical engagement with Sanders' more imperialist positions. Sometimes I'm more optimistic because I see a lot of confrontation among his supporters about, hey, this isn't okay. But then other times I see it completely ignored, and that concerns me. And it seems like something that could portend an issue down the road as well.
Right. Like, I think now he's remarkably, like, he's better than he was in the past on several issues. Like, you and I both have talked about the Israel-Palestine stuff in the past and things like that. And he likes to harp on the Iraq War, which I think is incredibly important. Obviously, he did support some, cases of military funding in the past. He did support the war in Afghanistan. He did support the bombing of Yugoslavia. He did, like, fill in the blank. There have been points where he has supported U.S. violence abroad over, perhaps diplomacy or other methods of, because I think, for example, if we look at Yugoslavia, there was a series of violence and people argue, genocide. And I think that you can say, well, is this like a World War II situation where we had to invade or bomb or whatever to rescue people? And I think that there's always a way before you get to that point, right? Like, there's always some alternative method. It's just a matter of the U.S. being willing to pursue that. And often, I think the humanitarian side gets raised to sort of clean up the U.S.'s record, but the U.S. is never interested in humanitarianism. Like, let's just be 100% real. That's not the goal of this country. So while that might be a side effect, like it might, the military violence might end up saving some lives because it puts an end to whatever acts of violence are going on within that country. The long-term effects are not necessarily those that bend toward the humanitarian record that the U.S. would like to pretend it has, and we still see, for example, in this country, anti-Semitism and violence towards Jewish people, violence towards Muslims, etc. And so, like, this idea that the U.S. is some sort of savior of the Jewish people or savior of Muslims in Bosnia or whatever is garbage because that's not the point that's not the reason why this country did those things. It might have been a side effect, but it's not the reason.
I was just going to say, and the truth that we've discovered throughout research is that the U.S. was actually inspiration for some of the most atrocious acts that were committed. And so, like, the reality of the situation versus the history I was taught in my, primary education is shocking.
Yeah. Absolutely. There was a book that came out, like I want to say last year or in 2017. I'm sorry, either last year or 2018, by a historian who lays down that track. He's like, these are this is the model from Jim Crow and whatnot that the Nazis followed. And in some areas, the Nazis thought that the US was too harsh in its methods of racial segregation. Like, can you imagine? Like, and we often, I mean, this is the thing that also bothers me, right? I want to get to the point where the Nazis are not the end all be all of human violence and evil in the world, because we have so many cases of violence and evil in the world, in some cases that led to even more deaths. If we're going to quantify it, right? If we're basing our degree of evil on the basis of how many people were killed. And that does not, by the way, involve denying the results of the Holocaust or denying that atrocity or underplaying it by any means. But my point is that we have to get beyond just the framing of one solitary evil, because I think what that does is that excuses all the others, right? So it helps us actually downplay what the US, just as one of many examples, has done in its history and its present. I mean, I would argue that what the US has done in Iraq is a form of genocide, because we invaded that country, we targeted those people, and we murdered hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, and continue to murder people there for reasons that are based on white supremacy and capitalist greed, much like the Holocaust was. And so we have to be very clear about the ways that this kind of centralized evil, or the framing of a centralized evil, actually takes away from our analysis of ongoing evils, concurrent evils, and evils that predated what the Nazis did. I mean, one of the things that people bring up oftentimes is slavery, worldwide, transatlantic slave trade, and then beyond that, the Arab slave trade that also into the sort of, East African slave trading and things like that. Then we look at colonialism and what atrocities were carried out under European colonialism. I mean, people getting their legs and arms cut off if they didn't meet a quota for whatever they had to mine. Like, these sorts of acts of violence get kind of brushed over when we can only see one group of actors as evil. And I think we have to get beyond just that. Like, kind of, I think it's a framing that makes sense. I understand it, but I want to get to the point where we can see that the American military also operates like the Nazis did. And it also operates like, fill in the blank, any other past historical group that enacted violence upon, the masses, right? Because, like 50 years from now, our children or grandchildren or whatever are going to be recognizing in real time, not in real time, but like using real facts. Are they going to be recognizing what the US has done in the 20th century as genocidal? Because if you turn the tables, right, and you say, how do the Iraqis see Americans? How do Iranians see Americans? How do, Vietnamese see Americans, right? That question, if you just turn the framing, right, and you talk to people who have lost family members, friends, whole communities to U.S. violence, that was, again, like I said, based on white supremacy and capitalist notions of the world order that the U.S. seeks to maintain. How do we then recognize that history? And I don't understand why it's so hard to do. Like, maybe it's just that we lack empathy and people are so brainwashed that they can't do it. But why is it that some people are deserving of humanity for us and some people are not? And that includes the way that we talk about history. And I feel like that has to change if we want to move forward and actually push the US on having better policies with the rest of the world.
No, absolutely. And some of the things that come to my mind, what you were saying evoked, is the Tuskegee experiments. They preceded and post-dated World War II, so the U.S. was doing experiments on people like that, and like what the Nazis basically were doing with Jewish people before Nazi Germany, and then after as well. And so, and all the things that you listed and many more that we don't have time to list. And like, there's so much out there. And some of the other ones that come to my mind that are more like, I guess, politically in people's minds are, we kind of it's generally accepted, I think, among reasonable people, I would say, that two of the largest threats to humanity as in general, beyond just our national borders, are climate change and nuclear proliferation.
Mm-hmm.
Those two are like reasonably understood to be global threats. And to the point earlier about the U.S. as an actor and so on and so forth, what we had, and then turning the tables or looking at it differently, is imagine we had two critical international deals on that front. We had the Paris Climate Accord, which, although insufficient, was at least a step in the right direction generally, although still, capitalist and all those types of things. So like had those weaknesses, but it had a recognition that there was a problem that needed dramatic solutions. And then the Iran deal, nuclear deal, which was signed on by countries including China. Like, so let's just imagine for a moment, if knowing the two largest threats to humanity are nuclear proliferation and climate change, if China had decided to just abandon its Paris Climate Accord obligations or commitments and abandon the Iran nuclear deal, like
Right.
that would be enough for the U.S. to go to war. Like we'd be ready to go to war, but we expect these other nations to just treat it as an aberration of U.S. foreign policy, and that the next president can just apologize and they should all just come back to the table and listen to this one, even though the next one may completely abandon the deal again, leaving them just more vulnerable while the U.S. gets further entrenched in a hegemonic dominance that jeopardizes not just their national sovereignty, but the lives of their populace indefinite, or it puts the lives of their entire nation in jeopardy, essentially. And
Yeah.
so one of the things that some of the more typically considered rational-minded foreign policy people have been saying is that Iran has the ability to do a lot in order to negotiate with the world, as far as coming to negotiations of avoiding conflict in general. But one thing that they can't do is undermine their own national interests and their own national sovereignty to serve the United States interests. And that's essentially the demand of our foreign policy in this situation, is that they submit their national interest and their sovereignty to our interest, and not in some sort of global, hey, we all need to do these make these commitments in order to survive, we're going to dominate you and damn the rest of the world to essentially an ecological disaster, and we're just going to make sure that we're well entrenched and that our oligarchy is well insulated from the damages.
And it's sad too. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
and it's just that seems to be the state. And like you said, just framing the issue and framing the circumstances in that way seems to be very difficult, or to get it framed in any sort of national stage. And
I think too, not to make this whole discussion about Iran, but it's just like on the front of my mind since everything had happened, between the last time we spoke and now. But it's sad too that like so many people end up dying as a result of our meddling, intervention, violence, etc., that are just, beyond just the people who are on the battlefield or like who live in the regions that we attack, but also when I think about this plane crash, like this situation is just, it's so tragic, because had the U.S. not murdered Soleimani and gone after Iraq and Iran and all of this turmoil and drama that they could have avoided, there would never have been a missile strike by Iran, and thus, the plane would never have been hit. Like, I think about these sorts of things all the time, and obviously I don't want to try to go back and have this alternative history, because, that's not a productive exercise. But I also feel like it's just one other very clear example of how this violence affects people who aren't even involved. You know what I mean? Like they're just, like, I don't know. It's just incredibly, incredibly tragic. And the US has to take zero responsibility about this, right? Like now it's on Iran. And I know that there have been protests in Iran related to the plane crash and things like that. And I'm not sure how Canada has reacted. I haven't been following that very closely. So I don't know if they decided to up sanctions or do anything in retaliation for the accident. But it just, like, I don't know. It makes me so angry just to know that this is what's being done at all. But it makes me more angry that it's being done in our names, with our tax dollars, with, in many cases, international support for the sake of not being within the US's wrath. I mean, there are people living under threat because if they give any sort of aid to Iran, whether that be material aid, military aid, just basic goods like trade and whatnot, they become threats. They become threatened by the United States. Like it's like mafia politics. You know what I mean? And people end up dying who have nothing to do with any of this. And I hate it. Like, I don't know what else to say other than it's disgusting and awful. And even to hear progressives on that stage last night, or just in general, continue to frame international policy as something in which the US should remain dominant is terrifying to me. Because it's like, and it's not, these things are not mistakes, if you will. Like, what the US does is not by mistake, it's by design. And I don't see them as a good actor. And I also recognize that no matter which person gets the nomination, that could be the most left person on that stage or the most right person on that stage, many things are going to stay the same. Because at the end of the day, no one on that stage is going to actively dismantle the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, or the US military. Like, not that stuff is all going to still be there, and we saw, for example, Elizabeth Warren in her discussion with Meghan McCain on The View, who's a complete idiot, but also with her discussions of her framing last night of US in the world. She likes to bring up military service in her family. Like, her brothers were in the military, and that means, I trust and believe in the military, and I honor the troops, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, this is where the framing comes in about the solitary evil, right? Because it's like, no one looks at the Holocaust and says, some of the Nazis were good people. Right? Like,
right?
Not all of the Nazis were bad. Some of them were all right. They didn't want to participate in this. And so, they kind of, some of them weren't interested in, they weren't doing it for white supremacist reasons. They were just doing it because it was their job. I don't know anyone who says that. Maybe there are people out there, but I'm not friends with any of them because I'm like, okay. But why is it all right for us to continue to prop up, valorize, and excuse the violence that these troops engage in? Like, they know when they sign up that their job abroad is to murder people, period. And you're going to murder innocent people. You're going to murder people in other countries that have done absolutely nothing to us. And you're going to murder people for the sake of capital gain that generally does not trickle down to you. I've seen a lot of debates going back and forth about how, but if you're poor and this and that, and the U.S. military targets poor people. Yes, they do target poor people, and that is unfair, and it's messed up. And poor people are very vulnerable to this kind of brainwashing because of their economic situation, which is why I think it's important for us to have a better safety net in this country so that people don't ever feel like they should take on a job that involves killing people very much like themselves in order to survive. But there's more and more data coming out that shows that actually the majority of the people that are volunteering to go to the military and end up actually going are like white and middle class. And so don't freaking tell me that you don't have a choice. What we should be working, instead of saying that and giving that excuse, is we should be working towards making sure that people don't feel like they're in a position where they have to make that choice at all. There should always be something that we can do to talk people out of going into the military, to encourage people to find other means, and to actually offer those means. Like, if we can help someone get a scholarship, if we can help someone find housing, if we can help someone with whatever their financial disparity is, instead of saying, well, I guess they didn't have any other choice. They had to join the military. Because it's to me, to continue to celebrate that kind of violence amid everything we know, right? Like, Elizabeth Warren is not stupid. She knows what the U.S. has done. And if we're looking at her age group, her brothers most likely volunteered or most likely were involved in the Vietnam War, or I don't know how old they are, but maybe the Iraq War, or maybe some of the earlier Iraq wars. But we're not talking about, World War II or something. Like, this is stuff that happened where we knew damn well that what the U.S. was doing was wrong. It was violent. It was imperialism, point blank, period. And like, I'm sorry, but like, I don't care if your brothers were in the military. That doesn't say anything about what you think about foreign policy. It just says to me that you're using that as a way to prop yourself up as some sort of champion for I don't know who, but yeah, like how does your brothers being involved in the military in some way give you foreign policy bona fides? Like my mom's a social worker. That doesn't mean I know the first thing about social work, right? So like I don't know. It just that kind of framing makes me crazy and I hate it and I don't feel like it's productive. And in many ways I think it undermines a much larger message, which is we shouldn't be in a position where we're sending soldiers anywhere because all of these acts by the US are ventures in imperialism, period.
Right. And yeah, just that framing in general concerns me. And I think one of the aspects that kind of gets highlighted in that is the importance of coalition building, but then the kind of the risks and the concerns of the difference between believing in, redemption and just being gullible and letting people infiltrate or, capitalize on your gullibility.
Yeah.
And so I don't have an answer personally for that, and I'm prodding and poking through theory to see what I find in general, and I'm finding some pieces, but it does feel generally, so far as to what I found, unsatisfactory as far as being able to kind of distinguish and delineate who and what am I looking at for something or someone that is capable of redemption and being integrated into a future kind of progress that we're trying to achieve, and then who is and should be readily identified as opposition, and so long as they maintain certain particular perspectives and so on and so forth, and kind of drawing those lines or understanding that gray area or any of that kind of thing is, I think, one of the things that a lot of people are struggling with that have uh, good intentions but probably feel somewhat unguided on the issue. And so I think discussing it is important. And so the perspective you bring, I think, is very important. And so I find myself agreeing with pretty much everything that you said there. And so I think one of the things going forward that's going to be, because one of the things I think about is harkening back to when we were reading about Castro and, the members of the military that were integrated into the revolutionary movement. So it's like, obviously the Cuban military has a different position in a lot of ways than somebody in the Cuban military has a different position than somebody in the U.S. imperialist army has in a lot of ways. And so I think that has to be also accounted for. But I think that there is some sort of area there that incorporates people that don't see things the way I see things, but are advocating something that is oppositional to what is, I think, within the realm of reasonable solutions to the problems that we face. They're outside of it. Is like, can they be brought into the realm of reasonable solutions, and then in conversation we come to one that is viable and sustainable and so on and so forth, or are they and will they forever be outside and identified as opposition, and should be, in that any sort of attempts to integrate them into a discussion or discourse, critical engagement about how we're going to solve these problems simply undermines it. And so I think that foreign policy is one of those places where I think that is really highlighted, particularly with, as you mentioned, the membership of the military and the roles that socioeconomics plays, and then also the philosophies. Like, if we think back to Vietnam, the sacrifices that people made in order to avoid going to that conflict were, I'd say, on par or worse than what you would see remaining in poverty in the United States without having to avoid a draft, but simply not volunteering to go into those engagements. And so I think that there's a fair argument to be made that we should focus on trying to provide those solutions and outlets so that people don't feel that way, regardless of its material reality, whether it is whether they really do have that as an only option to maintain some sort of economic security for them or their family.
Right. There's also, I applaud the veterans who have devoted their lives, basically. And we see this also with like the IDF in Israel. There's a group of former soldiers who basically have like become anti-war activists and who do whatever they can to talk people out of, like, in Israel, they have to join the military, men and women. They have conscription there. So or like a draft, like everybody is part of it. But, there are some people trying to work who've left the system and who've said, we're against war, we're against what Israel's doing to Palestinians, et cetera, that I think is positive. And unfortunately, they've been attacked repeatedly by, the Likud government. But one of the things that you do see in the U.S. is a similar movement of, former military personnel, veterans, and the like, who've said, you don't need to do this, you don't have to go to war, who try to talk to recruits and people who have recently considered going into the military, and to just kind of offer them other options and ways of sustaining themselves economically, and just also to offer support, right? Because I think, again, there's a degree of brainwashing that many Americans, like all Americans, are subject to. Let's just be honest, we're all subject to it. And I think if we don't have these moments that interrupt that brainwashing, then we continue to go along with the program. And it takes someone who's been in it sometimes to be able to show people who haven't that this is not some sort of movie. It's not a positive experience. It's a violent experience. It involves enacting violence towards women, children, pregnant people, grandparents, anybody, schools. You know what I'm saying? The touch of reality, I think, that comes from veterans can be really, really helpful. And I do see them as, like potential comrades, I guess I can say, in this process, because they've been through it and they know, like, they admit, I made a huge mistake. I shouldn't have gone into the military, but now that I did and I know what happens, I'm going to tell this truth and I'm going to be honest about what this country is doing. And I appreciate that kind of work. I also just wanted to add that, one of the things you mentioned about kind of knowing who can be on your side or not. I mean, it reminds me of what we read when we talked about Mao, because he has in that chapter about the military, but in some other chapters as well, like how to define your comrades, how to be able to kind of sift through who the real people are on your side and who are not. And this makes me think about Pete Buttigieg, because Pete Buttigieg, of course, was in the military and loves to bring up his military service. And many people have argued that, this was just like a stepping stone for him to get into office. And I would agree with that. It's like a photo op. Now, that's not to downplay whatever he may have experienced while there. But again, he went by choice. No one forced him. I mean, this man is a freaking Harvard graduate. He could have done myriad other jobs and things like that instead of going to the military, but decided to go to the military, and now uses it as like a form of clout over the other candidates by saying, well, I was in the military and I know this and know that and blah, blah, blah. But one thing he did mention last night that I thought was fascinating was the bit about how some elected officials don't even seem to understand AFRICOM, which was, but the ironic part is that he wasn't like, we should stop AFRICOM operations. He was just like, some people don't even know that we have soldiers in Niger. Okay, that is true, and scary. But I think that because there was a man who died recently, there's a U.S. soldier who was killed, who was involved in some sort of military operation through AFRICOM in Niger. All of them covert, of course. But I don't know. He is in a position where he could be like, this is the atrocity of war. This is why we shouldn't do this. This is why we shouldn't operate unilaterally in our foreign policy, blah, blah, blah. But he kind of just, I mean, Pete's all over the place. He doesn't ever really give a solid answer, which is one of the things that has always frustrated me about like trying to listen to him during the debates. He's always triangulating, like literally everything that comes out of his mouth is like from both sides of it. And so it's very hard to pin down how he feels about certain things, but I can guarantee you that like his work as a consultant and kind of like sheltered soldier in Afghanistan is not the basis on which we can look at him and say, oh yeah, Pete's going to be anti-war because he lived through this. I think if anything, it tells us that he's not going to care. And from the little bit that I do know about his foreign policy and like just in general policies, he's going to side with the sort of corporate interests over that of the people here or there, in other countries.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's an excellent point you make regarding Pete there. And I think one of the aspects that kind of, I guess, is really concerning in general is that just how few people are aware that, you know, the U.S. is imposing its imperialism also throughout Africa, you know, and the kind of terror that's being inflicted throughout Africa. And it's to another point of just, you know, kind of for me processing all of this, you know, and like my role and like where I stand in all of it. It's a, you know, one of the things that Africa brings to my mind is the DRC, and that like we're all using or listening with electronics that with all likelihood have some sort of cobalt or something mined by children for like 75 cents a day, and risking, you know, their lives and very makeshift tunnels and all these kinds of things, and just like the sheer horrific atrocity that is global capitalism and the US hegemony, and just like how easy it is to talk about the horror of people that work for insurance companies losing their job or things like that, but the horrific nature of what the US inflicts globally is just not even the news topic most of the time. Right. You know, it's so, I don't know, it's unnerving if nothing else, you know, just that we can lose so much humanity and see such horrific stuff happening all around the world and just go day to day without really even noticing. You know, like Australia and the Amazon are both on fire, and it's like they were playing tennis, and it was like people wouldn't even notice until one of the tennis players like collapsed in a coughing fit on the court. And it's just like, this just feels bizarre to me that we're doing this, you know, that we're like just going day to day while all of this is happening.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think especially on this point about Africa, like it's not even an afterthought, right? It's not a thought at all. Like it's not, the continent as a whole is not considered, despite the fact that it's obviously resource rich. I think some of the resource extraction there falls under the radar when it comes to our discussion of climate change and environment. And I mentioned this the other day on Twitter. I said, you know, we don't talk enough about mining and deforestation that's happening, and it mainly affects Latin America and Africa. But things that are done in that process involve incredible violations of humanity, and recognition of humanity. And I think also, of course, the collateral damage there is that of the environment. I often hear people talk about carbon emissions, about air pollution. We're thinking about kind of quote unquote first world forms of pollution. You know, people with cars, factories, and blah blah blah. And that the abundance of those, you know, pollution making devices. But there's not, and then I think also like there has been more of a discussion about recycling and trash and all of that, you know, like the amount of goods that the average American has, and how there's an overabundance of material things that they can't process, right? So we have trash that we're sending to other countries. And like I saw an article the other day where we're sending trash to China, and China was like, yeah, we're not going to take your trash anymore. And the US kind of freaked out. It's like, guys, like, do you hear how absurd that sounds? It sounds as absurd to me as like what we were talking about before, where people are getting mad that US troops who are the invaders are being attacked in other countries where we have no right to be. So a similar situation. But I think in that process, what ends up happening is that we don't talk about the effects of things like mining and deforestation, that in the case of mining in particular, like you said, goes towards all the devices that are supposed to sustain this environmental revolution, right? Our green revolution, and high-tech goods are often like solar panels and all this stuff, everything that we have that is potentially useful in, you know, like, I don't know, rectifying some of the damage that we've done, or attempting to on the environmental level. It still involves environmental damage. And we just don't talk about that side of things because it's not impacting workers in the US or in Europe. You know, it's impacting workers and children as you said, from other places that we like to just pretend don't exist, despite our always getting everything from them. I think one of the things I saw the other day as well was that There are several African leaders that are trying to make connections or like strengthen ties with the US and Europe in combating terrorism. And that's also scary because I'm just like, it's again the further militarization of the continent, which then, of course, is being done by oftentimes leaders who themselves are incredibly corrupt and who were elected under kind of strange premises and fill in the blank. There are lots of issues. These are not, we're not looking at revolutionary governments from the 70s and the 60s, you know, like post colonial movements. We're looking at people who have survived after all the other post-colonial leaders were assassinated or tricked or imprisoned or whatever. And we're looking at a set of leaders, I think, who are less interested in the needs of the people and more interested in lining their pockets, more interested in making Africa part of a larger neoliberal hyper-capitalist framework for the elites in those countries to benefit from. And I think it's being done, unfortunately, on the backs of the most poor and the most vulnerable. And I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes, you know, and I think it's very scary that it's, you know, I don't see an end to it coming in the future. I think it's going to get much, much worse. And I think where we're going to see, you know, we often talk about the kind of militarization that's going to happen amid climate change, where people are going to have private militaries and private police and stuff who literally will like guard water, you know, like, and guard the goods and basic needs that wealthy people need to have. I mean, this is what we're seeing happen in Africa right now. And it's not something that's going to be gradual. It's something that's literally happening and ramping up as we speak. I know for a fact in many, many, many countries where there's US military presence, it's intense, it's very real, it's on the ground. They get involved with, you know, voting. They get involved in, they like police, you know, the voting process. They train embassies. They do a lot of stuff that we don't talk about or know about here in the United States, but that I think is foreboding in really, really scary ways. But enough. I've said enough. Like that's, I feel like I keep rambling, so I apologize. But it's just like all of the topics last night from the foreign policy section. As I mean, I think a lot of people focused on like the framing of the questions, but I think the answers also were revealing in that no one offered an end to anything, you know, and a real end. No one offered a real solution to what's happening other than, well, I'm not going to be Trump, right? We know you're not going to be Trump, but like, what are you going to do going forward to make things better in US foreign policy? And we didn't see that. And that I think is really concerning, but we can switch to another topic because I think we spent longer than CNN did on it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say is we don't like the points that you're raising, and I think especially about post-colonial Africa and the kind of governments that we see there now is that you don't need, you know, an educated, like critically pedagogically educated populace in order to get to revolutionary violence that overthrows, you know, an oppressive regime, but you do need it if you don't want to end up in a similar or worse situation afterwards. And so like basically I see echoes of the, you know, Papa Doc kind of, you know, we're going to get rid of these oppressors and now I'm your oppressor and you're going to love it. And it's we see a lot of that throughout Africa. That's not every African nation. There's several different nations that have unique circumstances, which is, I guess, valuable to or worth pointing out as well, just as it too often gets lumped all together in generalized. But in interest of expediency, and as you mentioned already, having spent extended amount on foreign policy in general, I think healthcare was pretty much where they went next. That I think, as I mentioned at the top, the stark contrast in all of that time and not talking about really the cost in humanity besides U.S. soldiers, really, and the cost in treasure that they didn't talk about in foreign policy. That became at least the treasure part became the focus of the healthcare debate. And I'll just hand it off to you to talk about a little bit and come back.
Oh yeah, that's the go-to procedure, you know, like just how much is it going to cost to do healthcare, but we're not going to talk at all about how much it costs to launch wars all over the world. I think last night we got some quotes finally from people. Pete Buttigieg said that his healthcare plan was going to cost $1 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. Trying to, he tried, the centrists always like to try to offer a smaller amount. But the reality is obviously his healthcare plan isn't really a plan. It's not going to help anyone. And everything for Pete is means tested, even down to the college for all stuff, which, like, just listening to him talk about it, my eyes glaze over because I'm like, you're so full of shit that I can't handle it. But he likes to kind of make it seem as if these larger programs have to be means tested in a way to keep out the rich, except everyone knows that wealthy people are not going to send their kids to public college most of the time. And that even I'm actually surprised because last night the moderators asked him the question that had been on people's minds, which was like, we have libraries and public high school and roads, and rich people partake in those goods and resources. So, like, why are you trying to limit it? Why are you trying to limit the college experience only to a certain set of people? And how are you going to measure that? How are you going to like, are people just every year going to have to submit their taxes to show how wealthy their parents are? Like, just how is this going to work, on the administrative level as well? So I think that there was some care from the moderators in that sense. They weren't as great on the healthcare discussion, though. And again, it's almost like every time we get to the healthcare discussion in these debates, it's always the same thing over and over. I have not seen one variation in the discussion of healthcare. It's always, how much is it going to cost? What are we going to do about all the people who get knocked off their insurance? And then last night, the issue of trying to work with insurance providers, workers was interesting. But, like, I don't understand why people can't see that people who work for the insurance industry now will be incredibly useful working for the government and a state level if we switch to a Medicare for All program, because they would help administer not only the making sure that everyone gets their care. So we would see an uptick in people who do social work and helping break down the plans, explain the plans, and assign plans for people. But it also, they would be needed to just like work phones, work offices, deal with the sort of logistic nature of things. So I'm not sure why everyone's afraid that like all these insurance people are going to lose their jobs. Like, I don't know. It's kind of a weird preoccupation to me. I feel like the preoccupation should be on the fact that there are like millions of people who are dying because they don't have healthcare, or they're not covered, or their healthcare is too expensive. And I just want to put one anecdotal thing in there. So today I went to the doctor because I'm like at the doctor every day now, practically. And I asked them just out of curiosity. I was like, so how much is my C-section going to cost? And they're like, well, the total is $8,000. And I was like, okay, that's a lot of money. And apparently my insurance covers 90% of that. So I'm still going to have to pay money out of pocket. But I know people who I don't even understand, but there's insurance plans that like won't pay for C-sections. In some cases, there are insurance plans that won't pay in full, that won't pay nearly as much of the amount that I receive. And I say this as someone, I have like decent insurance, but like, it's just crazy to me that in this country to have a C-section costs that much. To have a baby, I think, costs $5,000, just like vaginal birth. And like, for what? I have in-laws from Turkey that paid, around $50 to $100 to have their babies. And it's just shocking to me. Like, when I hear these numbers, it's shocking to me. And I'm wondering who's getting that money, because I know it's not going straight to my doctor. I know it's not going straight to the hospital. Like, who are we paying with this? And why is it so expensive? And that something has to give. I cannot. When I hear the numbers that don't make sense to me, they don't make any sense to me. And so I think last night's discussion and any of these discussions that we've seen on the debate stage about healthcare have been insufficient, because their focus is always how much is the program going to cost, as opposed to how much does healthcare cost right now to the average American citizen, and who doesn't have the money to pay for this sort of stuff.
It's not just you, and like we've seen, there's that video that went somewhat viral from the UK about U.S. healthcare. It doesn't make sense to any, like, most industrialized nations look at our healthcare and it just doesn't make any sense. Like, the idea that people would be put out and left to die or go bankrupt because they can't get basic treatment, or end up with critical conditions because of not being able to get regular access to see physicians and so on and so forth, that the wealthiest nation in the world is in such a state of disrepair is confounding to any like reasonable people around the world, like not even just countries with demonstrably better healthcare systems than us, but countries that are building their healthcare systems. And when they're looking globally for models and ideas about how to improve them, they presume that the wealthiest country in the United States would be one of the places that they should look. But what they realize is that when it comes to actually providing care to the people that need it, that's not something the U.S. excels at. When it comes to providing absurdly expensive and technologically advanced services for a very small group of people, that is one of the places that the U.S. does tend to lead in some ways. But even there, it doesn't lead in all the way in every category and for every particular situation. And so it's shocking. Just to reiterate, it's just shocking globally that the United States healthcare system is what it is. And so, but we're constantly told that we should just, kind of more or less accept it. And then the other thing that happens, as you mentioned in all of these debates and has been going on basically since we started, there was a start to pitch the ACA, was, ACA versus a nationalized system and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we've discovered demonstrably throughout the time that the ACA has been enacted, besides being inadequate, providing the care that people need, it's legally, the legal framework of the way that the United States functions, it's more vulnerable to the wanton destruction of it by both insurance interests and Republicans and a variety of other interests that see value in undermining or destroying the small benefits that were gained through the ACA. And so something like a Medicare for all or a nationalized system is not only stronger in the performance category as far as being able to actually deliver the care that people need, it's also stronger constitutionally and within the legal framework of the United States. So long as that we're going to be beholden to it, which I guess Trump is pressing daily, the framework that we need to use and the policy that best matches that framework is a nationalized Medicare for all type system, rather than trying to work with the ACA, which is what you'll hear from all of the basically all of the other candidates.
Right. I keep wondering though, like, I mean, I'm not a legal scholar or healthcare medical field scholar. And I don't know fully how this would work, but one of my concerns is just looking at the ongoing dismantling of the NHS. It makes me wonder, like, how do we make sure that a program, like if we were to implement Medicare for all, is solid? I think that's one of my biggest fears, because it seems like, of course, so much legislation in the US is subject to the next person who comes into office, right? And Trump has done so much damage in his short period of time in office that it's like unreal. And so I wonder, because I feel like whoever becomes president next, if it's a Democrat, he or she is going to have to spend the first chunk of their administration just undoing the shit that Trump did, and so part of me wonders, like, how do we make sure that a program like this is foolproof and has fail safes and will not be dismantled upon entry of a Republican president next time, or a series of Republican senators or representatives or whatever, because this is what we're seeing happen in England right now, and also what we're seeing happen in other countries as well that had a universal nationalized, socialized healthcare system. Now, because of neoliberal actors, are bringing in insurance companies and trying to kind of take apart their systems. And yeah, it's just a fear in the back of my mind. I because we often like to cite Social Security with, Social Security is a good example of, like, some legislation that's had staying power and that people have not been successfully able to dismantle. But when you think about how little Social Security people in our generation are going to get, and then our kids are not going to have any, and then also just like how there are even Democrats who are trying to get rid of Social Security, and what they call quote unquote entitlement programs. I mean, it's kind of scary to me. And I wish that would be part of the discussion too. Like, not only just this, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to implement it? But also, how do you keep it from disappearing? And And it's one of those things that like comes up often when we talk about Andrew Yang, because we say, well, he's doing the whole UBI thing. And unfortunately, under his plan of UBI, it would get rid of like welfare. And or that's kind of like the underlying message, that's this like libertarian streak of his UBI plan, in that people who take the UBI are no longer eligible for multiple social programs. And so some people see this as a kind of Trojan horse for people to get rid of social programs altogether. And so I keep wondering, like, how can we also talk about making sure that a healthcare plan like this is permanent? I don't know. It's just sort of a rhetorical thing floating around for me, but I keep wondering that, and I'm frustrated that people don't really seem to think about that or have like a backup plan. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too cynical here, but yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think part of how that is, I guess, kind of highlighted is with the concept of whether it's an opt-in or automatic kind of program. And I think having it be automatic, and from the standpoint that healthcare is a fundamental human right, and essentially arguing that aspect of it and incorporating it through that kind of mechanism is the way, like, I'm not speaking specifically about particular policy details, but essentially as far as the framing in general is as healthcare as a human right, and that it's making it as intrinsic as I would say the First Amendment, but even that is in jeopardy sometimes.
Right.
So I think one of the things that theory tells us is that the permanence of any of these gains is only secured by continued vigilance. Right. You can't expect any of these gains to be maintained without constant reticence and attention paid towards their maintenance. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes sense just from a practical point of view. One of the other aspects, let's see here, I had something here, I'll find it in my notes. I mean, I guess one of the things briefly I definitely want to talk about climate, and kind of two of the aspects of that I think came up that were important to somewhat highlight is the USMCA trade deal and Warren's defense of it, essentially just kind of disregarding concerns about the climate.
Yeah.
That's, to me, I mean, I know a lot of people got very upset about the personal drama that took place during and preceding and after the debate. But if there was one particular event that would have taken her from consideration, or taking her away from consideration for me, although admittedly she wasn't there in the first place, it would have been that kind of disregard for the environmental concerns in the acquiescence to Trump's agenda. Those two factors are just like not demonstrative of the type of leader that could even, the analogy that I use is, like a lot of these people want to just get inside the oligarch's house and then bar the door when they get in. Bernie seems like the only one that might not drop the bar on the door when he gets in there. He still leaves it up to us to kick it in and to do something about what's going on inside. But he might at least leave it open, and as the rest of them are going to bar it and put bars on the outside and hire new armed guards to stand in front. That's where we're at. And so when I saw that from Warren, it very much felt like, oh, okay, she's willing to sacrifice the environmental concerns and the people that are going to be sacrificed by it. Their humanity is disregarded with these types of policies, and to give Trump a win and just to basically fit in with what the Democratic agenda is, which is, to me, needs to be articulated as also unacceptable in light of Trump's agenda as also unacceptable, perhaps more obscenely unacceptable. But for me, the issue isn't, the lesser of, in that it's, the priority is that they are both unacceptable, and we cannot allow them to perpetuate, not only because the moral imperative, but our survival as a species is dependent on it as well, and any sort of life worth living in the hellscape that these people are preparing for us is dependent on us taking these types of actions and taking in considerations. And that's what I guess made Warren's response so obscenely absurd to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's something that got overshadowed with all the personal drama stuff. I also, my husband and I were both watching when they were talking about the job stuff, and that particular deal. And I just kept thinking to myself, they keep bringing up how this is necessary for workers, and so we had to do something, and otherwise people would lose their jobs and blah 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 blah. But like, I just don't. I don't know. There are obvious problems with it. I'm not as well versed on the degree of difference between this program and NAFTA, but I do think that, just kind of having a basic understanding of it, that it's something that the Democrats didn't necessarily have to have like succumbed to and voted for. But it was at that weird time. I feel like because it was also like amid all the impeachment stuff, and then this was happening, and so people were like, "Why would you try to impeach the president?" But then at the same time, you're supporting a bit of legislation from him. Like, what is happening? It was like simultaneous.
To speak to my
event.
understanding of like congressional going ons, essentially what transpired was in order to get the centrist Democrats to sign on to the impeachment, Pelosi had to give them wins that they could take back home, and the trade deal was one that was going to include both particular talking points and then potentially pork that they could bring home to their particular districts.
I mean, that's sickening, and like this also reminds me of Warren's support for all the AUMFs and like military funding, in this case under Trump and other presidents. But like, come on, I don't know. I'm so frustrated with her because I am one of those people who was like, okay, if Bernie doesn't pull through for some reason or another, and it gets to the point where Elizabeth is the front runner in the primary, then maybe I would vote for her. Like if Bernie had to drop out or something like that. Like she's very far away from Bernie, in my opinion, in terms of her progressivism, but she was like the next kind of best thing of the worst things. You know what I mean? Like if I had to do a hierarchy of like best to worst,
particularly that consideration came up around Bernie's heart attack. Like,
exactly. And so there was definitely something in the back of my mind where I was like, okay, well, would I be able to vote for her? And last night, among many nights, I'll just, I had already had it in my head that like I was not going to vote for her under any circumstances. But I think last night's debate really put that nail in that coffin in multiple areas, like multiple nails in the coffin for that. Because I think there were many points in time last night where we started to really see, and I think this is in part because she seems to be trying to appeal to more centrist voters right now, because she realizes that Bernie people are not going to have her. And especially not after what we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that she's kind of, I think, more confidently trying to move to the right, or at least be herself, I guess, since she's a former Republican and has a lot of the and I don't say that as like you can't be a Republican and then change and be better. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying is like this part of her is kind of starting to come out, I think, more clearly right now, because she initiated her campaign as like, I'm a progressive and I'm with the Bernie wing of the party and blah, blah, blah. And I think now she's kind of like already turning to the center. And this is a move that normally you don't see until the general election, that she's kind of already going in that direction. And I think that you're bringing up the trade deal is a really important point that adds to that argument, because she didn't have to support it. But at the same time, this is why, like, again, I've already expressed support for Bernie, at least in this primary. I'm going to vote for him. But that's not to say that I don't have myriad criticisms of him. One of which was one of many is that during the when the government was shut down, the legislation to bring the government back online basically was a deal that involved some really creepy and awful measures when it came to immigration, including like supplementing the quote unquote smart wall and all this stuff that kind of threw undocumented people under the bus. And Bernie supported that. Whereas, if I'm not mistaken, Warren did not, Gillibrand did not, Booker did not. There were some other people who were still in the race at the time who didn't support it. And it wasn't like Bernie's vote wasn't like a tiebreaker or something. He didn't have to vote for that bill. I get the double-edged sword aspect of it, because then if he hadn't voted for the bill, then people would be like, oh, you don't support workers. But at the same time, I think you can have an argument about supporting workers that doesn't involve, like jeopardizing the safety of undocumented people. And you have to get to the point where you recognize undocumented people as potential workers in this country who can and should be allowed to make strides with US born, native born workers as comrades. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't understand the disconnect on that front. Why we can't recognize undocumented people as potential union members and people who are also fighting for workers' rights, but that's a separate issue. But I don't
I
know.
think it. Go
Frustrating.
ahead.
No. I was just saying I'm just frustrated with the quote unquote progressive candidates because they're very quick to sell out certain demographics.
Yeah,
All
no,
of them.
and there's you can go back in Bernie's history, and there's little things will pop up that kind of indicate the sort of nationalist perspective towards protectionist worker attitude in Sanders' platform, and Sanders, for all of his pluses and minuses, one of the things I think is he is relatively consistent and sincere, and so like I don't think he says that just to appeal politically to a white working demographic. I think he actually believes it, and it runs through a thread that concerns me about Sanders in general, about kind of really, in my opinion, abandoning trying to secure support from a lot of more marginalized communities, particularly Black Southerners and older Black Southerners in particular, and then also sacrificing the global South and the conceptions of the Green New Deal as it exists currently under kind of the progressive umbrella. And so I would echo that, and then also his support of the F-35 program in Vermont as a jobs program all fits this kind of willingness to sacrifice brown black bodies both domestically and internationally. One could say it's for political expediency, but to me, I think it has a lot more to do with just the hegemonic beliefs of America and the superiority of white supremacy and stuff. And like, this isn't to call Bernie Sanders a white supremacist or like to make that point, but just to say that like he, like all of us, is susceptible to that, and that's one of the places that we see, particularly for Bernie, where it has secured itself relatively stable in his perspective towards things. I don't think he's completely immovable, but I also don't think it's realistic to expect him ever to reach a position that reflects that kind of solidarity that it should be. And I think, the social democrat tendencies that he would describe as democratic socialism, I think carry on to that and build into that. And so like that's one of the concerns that raises me is that I would echo in when it comes to the progressive representation on that stage. And obviously Warren performed more poorly in that regard, but I would be remiss to not also criticize what I saw flawed in Sanders' approach there as well. One of the things that also kind of both surprised me, concerned me, it just gave me a bunch of mixed emotions in combination was Steyer's declaration that, he's going to call a state of emergency and the mentioning of Black and brown communities. The sincerity of that I question. And then when Sanders, which of anything that he said on that stage that night sounded the most like something he would say for electoral reasons, was that he would support anybody on that stage if they got the nomination. It's like, wait a minute, you're telling me you're even considering supporting a billionaire? Like, I understand the dynamics of all what's at play here, but do we not want to at least hedge that a little bit? Something like, because fundamentally, I know Steyer of the billionaires, it's like him and Hanau are the better ones, I guess. But as was pointed out, ironically, by the CNN commentators in one of their few moments of decent journalism or moderation, was you did make most of those billions off of oil and gas, or at least some of them. And for me, Steyer's answer was inadequate and insufficient. And I'm not entirely convinced the Giving Pledge isn't mostly to screw over their kids more than it is to contribute back to society. Like, they just don't want to, they feel like their kids are ungrateful. They don't want to leave too much wealth to their children more than they want to give back their ill-gotten gains back to the societies, or at least the following generations of the society that they stole it from.
Steyer's a weird one because he has a tendency in all of these debates to sort of just echo what other people are saying. Like, I don't know. I have trouble sometimes pinpointing what he actually stands for, because he's always like, yeah, Bernie's right, or like Liz is right, or so-and-so's right. I mean, the only person he kind of was like, they're not right, last night was Buttigieg. So he kind of, I wouldn't say went after Buttigieg, but he said some negative things about Buttigieg that Buttigieg was then forced to rebut. But in general, I don't understand why he's there other than this being a vanity project. Because just with like his campaign funding alone, he could have like ended world hunger or whatever, like it just seems kind of like a silly project. I don't fully understand what he's doing up there, but I certainly, like you said, if I were Bernie, I would not have expressed support for him or a variety of other people on that stage. I don't know. It was like, but again, the thing is that we have to remember the circumstances in which he said that, which was in this whole debacle about the sexism stuff, right? So this is the reason he said that, if I'm not mistaken, was like after he was saying that, I would support, he said it because he was like, I would support any candidate, including women, obviously, because even he was like, even though, of course, I would rather be the one who wins, but I would support anybody on the stage, But I just want to go ahead and transition into that. I know it's kind of been talked to death at this point, but I'm so frustrated by what I'm seeing happen already in this race. And I think, I'm not one of those people who's like, Liz is lying. Like, I think there's a lot of that.
100 snake emojis.
Yeah, like snakes. I'm not one of those people. I don't personally think like I'm not a person who was in that room, right? I'm not Liz Warren. I'm not Bernie Sanders. I think the timing is kind of suspect. I think the release of all this drama happening in the past, like 3 days has been a little suspect. I also couple that with the fact that like, I know she has a lot of Clinton campaign advisors and fans and, et cetera. The other thing is I'm tired. I'm really tired. And we saw this in 2016. We see it now of people on the side of these kinds of candidates weaponizing identity, weaponizing very important language around like rape and trusting people of color, trusting women, things like that normally should be taken seriously. I think that they weaponize and use for political gain in ways that I find incredibly offensive. So for me personally, I don't like the rhetoric on either side of this, right? This discussion. I don't like the way progressives have responded necessarily, and I don't like the way that the Warren campaign and her backers have responded. With all that said, though, I do find the situation odd because it just, the timing is weird. And I think that regardless of how either party remembered it, the way CNN responded to it was weird because like that threw red flags up for me that something is going on. Like this is orchestrated. This is planned. Sorry. Warren's response to the question by Abby Phillip was incredibly rehearsed. So it felt very coordinated to me. And just in case anyone like doesn't know what we're talking about, I don't know why they wouldn't, but we're talking about the fact that Warren alleges that Bernie Sanders said that a woman couldn't win in a run for president. And during their meeting in 2018, which was a private meeting between the two of them, and that CNN leaked on the supposed reference of 4 people who knew of the discussion. Again, like all anonymous sources, that whole thing. But the whole process to me felt suspect. But I just felt just kind of thinking about my own instincts, right? Looking at body language, thinking about past behaviors. It makes me question Warren's side because she has a history of lying. We know that. Like she lied about her Native American heritage that is minimal at best and not necessarily certifiable as like an actual Native American, right? So she has like a very small amount of quote unquote Native American blood. But as anyone who's been following this story understands, that's not how indigeneity is determined in the United States. And by indigenous people in particular, it has to do with community involvement, closeness, and all this other stuff that I have actually learned about because of this, wild story that she had for so many years. And I actually, for those who may have missed it, I was at a historical association meeting 2 years ago where I listened to several indigenous scholars talk about this issue and how blood quantum is not the reliable source and how people identify themselves as Native American, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can find that thread on my Twitter page. because I did a live tweet of what they were talking about during the conference talk. But in general, I just find her side of the story suspect. And it's not because she's a woman, by the way. I just want to make that clear, because I know some people have said, oh, people don't believe her because of sexism, whatever. I mean, I think if she didn't have a history of lying, if it weren't the timing that it was, if the Iowa caucuses, weren't 3 weeks away from now, if she had shown some sort of frustration, contention, disagreement with Sanders throughout the campaign up until now, if she had opened her campaign with this story as a potential motivation for her to run, etc. There are so many things that could have happened that would have made me say, okay, I believe that he said that, right? I believe Warren's side of the story. But the series of the events, the lead up to this, the way it unfolded, the question framing itself, the fact that she has a history of lying, her body language during the discussion, just all of it. And then even after the debate, which I'm sure you saw, all of it left me with a bad taste in my mouth. And it felt like a very cheap attempt to use a very legitimate issue to then undermine the campaign of someone who does have women's backs. Like, I'm sorry, but so much of Bernie's legislation actually benefits women tremendously. And so I just, for me personally, like I found it strange. I don't know. I have, and again, this is not, but I also, I just want to say one more thing. Like, I also was frustrated by some progressives' response to this, which was, oh, she's pulling identity politics and blah, blah, blah. I saw a lot of that last night. I saw a lot of people, complaining about her pulling the woman card and this and that. And like, y'all don't have to do that. None of that's necessary. All you have to do is show like a consistent pattern of lying, a consistent pattern of distorting the truth, a consistent pattern of engaging in some things lately that have been, like suspect as campaign strategies. And also like the fact that she's not doing well in the polls. She is fighting right now for her survival in the campaign prior to a very important vote. And so this is normal behavior if you're under that kind of pressure. But it's not necessarily behavior that I would condone. But I don't like either side's response to this. I don't know. Where are you on this situation, if anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in general. Like, it was generally an uncomfortable moment. The Steyer's face during the post-debate handshake, I think, kind of summed up the, like, certain feelings, I guess. There was definitely an evoked, like, just a WTF moment when the CNN moderator was like, so, Sanders, you just emphatically denied it. And so just to be clear, you are saying that didn't happen. And he was like, yes, that's correct. And then she completely disregarded that answer in order to feed Warren the question that she did. And that was just mind numbing. And then it, I guess, set the stage for what became the post-debate coverage, which I think just cemented the idea that it seemed coordinated, in that,
yeah,
like, there was even at one point somebody that was previously a big advocate for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign that was essentially saying it's not a he said, she said, despite Anderson Cooper having to, this happened pre and post debate, but pre-debate Cooper corrected it. It's like, it's literally a he said, she said. That's like, literally, it's like that CNN listened to 4 anonymous people granting them anonymity for no stated reason, which is against basic journalistic practices. That they reported that doesn't change the fact that it's a he said, she said. And so that was just bizarre in general. And like the level of, like, not just, misinformation, but disinformation, like actively undermining reality with what you're saying is just, I guess I shouldn't be surprised at this point from any major corporate outlet, really. But that it was when so many people were going to be paying attention and would presumably have seen the interaction themselves. It seemed heavily reliant on stripping out the context of the actual what happened and the preceding and post events, and strictly focusing on a narrative that they were going to construct that was absent what actually transpired, and seeing the coverage afterwards. Because I keep that stuff on generally as background noise a lot of the time, and so like, that's I see some of it, and so what I saw after the debate as well, and even in some of the coverage in this morning, it was very much a retelling of that event that was selling the story that Warren essentially capitalized on feminist energies from that moment, kind of spiting Sanders, misogynistic attitudes about women leaders, basically, is kind of how it's being sold in specific media outlets. And the tendency of those media outlets, and compared to their coverage of 2016, there's some consistency there that also, I think, leads to some sort of coordinated or directed attempt that was more of an electoral strategy, whether it originated with Warren herself or people within her camp, or even people outside of her camp. Warren's handling of it, especially when it was presented in that stark contrast on the stage, was abysmal and just disheartening and just generally concerning. And so I agree with what you said there. And for the only other aspect, I guess, you mentioned kind of the response from progressives, and to one degree, I get when people express things like, I can't believe, people are saying that they will or won't support a candidate based off of their interactions with supporters. I understand that. It does seem petty and childish, and if you weren't online, you would probably not even say that, because you wouldn't interact with them enough to have them have that kind of impact on your opinion. But because of the nature of being always online and so on and so forth, I think that there's a larger sentiment of like that's expressed. But then from the other side, I also remember Bernie's 2016 campaign when I was first getting interested, and then he had that Netroots moment, and I saw the vitriol from a lot of his white supporters towards just Black issues generally, not even just like what took place on that stage, and then also with the interruption that followed in Seattle, like not just taking issue at that, but then just vitriol launched towards just Black people in general and Black issues and the significance and importance of racial issues generally to a platform, and all those types of things. And it's not so much that like I wouldn't support Sanders because of them, but it makes me sincerely question the type of revolution that he is taking a leadership position in. Is like, what are the revolutionaries within his ilk? What kind of revolution are they after? And that is one of, like, that event back in 2016 concerned me. Some of the things, though, I would say not to the degree, for probably personal reasons, because I'm not a woman, so they don't affect me the way that the ones about Black people did particularly. But then also, I think the level of invective has been toned down generally in some ways, although it's also been escalated in others. And so I think the consideration for sexism, I think, is in the forefront of people's mind more so. But I think the kind of the temperature of the general rhetoric is also raised overall.
And I think too, like, to add to that, it's not just about it's not even about the woman comment or the alleged woman comment. But I think like what the anger over that symbolizes and how it can be extended to other things. So like you mentioned, like, okay, you're not a woman, but the Black stuff bothered you. But like, I think sometimes the smaller comments can be shorthand for bigger ideas. So like I said, I saw some people last night saying, like calling this identity politics and whatever. And that terminology has been so distorted within our discussions about race and gender and things like that, sexuality and whatnot on the left as of late, because what's happening is like people on the left are co-opting right-wing framing of what identity politics means, and also neoliberal weaponization of identity politics. And then that is what they're getting angry over. And I've said this since like 2016, 2017. It's very obvious what's going on, but people don't want to come to terms with it. And to me, it comes across as like a dog whistle. I mean, when I hear it, I know that that's a blanket term to be like, I'm angry at Black people, women, gay people, etc., for bringing up their issues and not just sticking to class. And that to me is a failure to recognize the way these all intersect with the matters of class. Like the way that we deal with economic inequality in this country has to also account for the disparities of economic inequality on the basis of these different identity markers. And so like for me, I see it not just being a woman, but also see the anger over identity issues in general, right? You get what I'm saying? Like they
No,
might be
yeah.
just talking about the woman thing, but it's like that becomes a like you lasso in all these other groups by being angry about that. And again, like I don't know who said what. I don't know what went down. I wasn't there. I know one person has a history of lying a lot and one person does not. And I know one person is fighting back against a potential loss in Iowa, and one person is looking at a potential win in Iowa. So these things have to be taken into account. But I think the response sometimes to these things are angry to the point where I feel like it can be applied to like I feel like I guess what I'm saying is like who you're going to be mad at next and why, right? And I think
Absolutely.
any interruption to that, like any discussion of identity gets so like even if it's like a very basic like not an angry one, not one that like throws Bernie under the bus, quote unquote, or whatever, just like mentioning it, some people's response to that is so vitriolic that it this sort of moment triggers that feeling in me. You get what I'm saying? Like it, I don't know.
No, absolutely, and I agree totally. And I just mean to just as a point of clarification, I mean to say like it's easier for me to miss the things that are aimed directly towards women
Oh
than it
yeah,
is.
no, I
Yeah,
didn't take
like
that
yeah,
wrong.
I didn't think so. I guess for our audience, just to clarify.
Yeah.
But the point that you make about how the anger kind of tags in a bunch of other groups and people with less than savory ideologies or perspectives, and like a lot of these hegemonic ideas of isms and such so forth that are just kind of superimposed or also integrated into their what is generally considered more leftist perspective, but then
Mhm.
is kind of also tainted with a nationalist and white
Oh yeah.
supremacist hegemonic kind of ideas. And so like one of the ways that I think that it was captured really well, CGP Grey, who has other issues, but they did do a great video on kind of how this process works. It's called the video is called "This Video Will Make You Angry." You can look up Google "angry germ," you'll find it. But it's a great video. I highly recommend people watch it just for generally understanding online interaction, especially, but just also the kind of aspects and concepts that you were describing there with how the kind of anger and vitriol draws in these different groups, and then how and why that can be beneficial towards the essentially the oppositional forces to the type of revolutionary energy and ideas that I personally at least and I think generally a lot of listeners and the kind of general theme of a lot of the work we do is aimed at. And
Mhm.
so like uh the basic to give a basic outline of it quickly is just when the anger ideas and these arguments spread and incorporate more people than things that we all just agree on or that don't inspire these types of outrageous interactions and don't inspire people to point out, in their anger, they made a comment that offended this group and then draw this group into an argument between these two groups about whether the use of this is, that or is, productive and so on and so forth, and draw attention away from the core disagreement or the core issues that need to be resolved in order for progress to be made. And so with your concern about how uh, this type of vitriol that was expressed by progressives towards Warren also kind of, I guess it doesn't just like bring them in the sense that they say these things, but what it also does is they're able to make comments that without the context of who is making the comment sounds like something you agree with, but then any sort of further examination of where that's coming from and why they said that will expose that your agreement with that particular sentiment actually undermines what you're trying to express. And
Mhm.
it's like I see a lot of that, and I find myself sometimes falling victim to it too. One of the reasons why my Twitter account is usually generally barren, just because it's like it's an ordeal to really kind of engage with people in that type of way where you don't necessarily recognize or realize that your amplification of their message or whatever they're saying might actually amplify or draw attention to things that you're not trying to draw attention to, and expose people that wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to those ideas or that concept exposed to it and vulnerable to it because it more quickly and readily aligns with their hegemonic beliefs rather than the more radical ideas that you're trying to expose them to.
It sounds like, to me, what you're kind of describing is like a rhetorical version of political entryism, where it's like you introduce someone to an idea, it sounds okay, and then you keep introducing them to things that like kind of move further and further to the right, but they've gotten the like little bit where it seems like it's revolutionary, but in actuality it's like trying to sheepdog you into something that's way more, that's like antithetical to what your beliefs are. But with gradual introduction, to those more unsavory beliefs, you start to then like accept, well, because I see this all the time when I think about like one of the think about the Hills Rising, right, which is a show that I have considerable issues with. But there's a Crystal Ball is one of the hosts, and Sagar and Jetty is another host, and he's like a Trump voter. He's a freaking right winger, but every now and then he says things that like sound a little leftish, and so then Crystal Ball will latch onto that, and other people will latch onto that, and then keep spreading his message. And even Crystal Ball herself has, in my opinion, done this as well, where she says things that are like super reactionary, but because she has like left bona fides, kind of soften that. And it also helps soften what Sagar is saying. And so I think that, what you're describing is like the online version of this. And I don't know how to remedy it, but it's frustrating to see how many people are susceptible to it because, and it's something I've written about, something I've thought about for a long time. I just feel like I'm concerned about what it's going to mean if we get a Sanders presidency. Because I wonder, where is the place for dissenting voices to things that Sanders may do that others have grown to accept as what has to be done to forward a left agenda, right? Like we have to throw immigrants under the bus, or we have to ignore gender or race or whatever, or only talk about race when it comes to criminal justice stuff, or what, you know what I'm saying? Like we've gone over his issues many times, but the point that I'm trying to make is that my concern always in the back of my mind is, if I have to put aside these concerns to express support for someone, which I don't, but I'm saying in general, when you go make a vote, you're kind of doing that, right? What does it look like if he does become president? Who's going to be in his cabinet? Who's going to be listening to those of us who say this is good, but it could be better, right? How can we make it better if we have an audience of Sanders supporters that try to, at this stage, even consistently downplay where there are problems? What is it? What happens when he's in power? And how does that revolution sustain itself if the revolution has been kind of absorbed into the presidential process, and going along? Instead, does the quote unquote revolution then just become a sidearm of government and governance, presidential governance, as opposed to a unit that is meant to challenge the president and change and push him further to the left?
Yeah, and social democracy is a demonstrably and marked improvement from where we're at now, but it also isn't good enough to stave off like climate apocalypse. So we have to do better. And I think I don't get the impression from a lot of Sanders supporters that they recognize that Sanders is far from good enough. Like not just, not just a little off, but the types of radical change that are necessary in the time frame that we need in order to hopefully save hundreds of millions of people and avoid displacing more is it's significantly greater than what Bernie Sanders offers. And so and I don't think that he's going to magically in his at this age have a revolutionary change of thought that leads him to believe that it is so inadequate, although who knows, that could happen. And so I don't rule it out. So, and I try to keep my revolutionary optimism both there, but also in check. But the reality is that it's going to take a massive movement of people and a type of engagement that we haven't seen since Vietnam. But it's also important for us to remember, just because this was also part of the discourse recently with the lead up to Iran. So I wanted to mention something about it at least. that while the Vietnam protests in themselves didn't end the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese people did that. They did undermine the ability of the American war machine to continue to send more and more bodies onto the front lines by undermining the draft and preventing that from being both effective while it was maintained, and then also getting it eventually eliminated. But that doesn't mean that then the American military was permanently disabled or unable to be able to effectuate its imperialist agenda. It just meant that for a moment it was unable to continue that particular track. And so it takes constant and active engagement, and at those types of levels. And I would say, while all protests have served purposes and have value in some ways, that the types of protests that are necessary are also going to be the types of ones that resulted in thousands of people getting arrested.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess with what we saw on the debate stage, the last kind of thing that I'll just say, and with the consideration for all the concerns that it laid out about what we face, I stay optimistic that there are people out there and that there's a potential and possibility for us to make the kinds of changes. And despite people concerned about the IPCC's increasingly alarming warnings about a 10-year deadline, you can do a lot in 10 years. The entirety of World War II was fought in less than 10 years. So changing the global kind of direction that we're heading and the type of order that we're under is possible. It may take a global conflict. It may not. Ideally is what I would like to believe, and I hope for and continue to push for on a regular basis. But I also recognize that the necessity of doing something radical and revolutionary remains, and those that don't see that, at least in that moment, are oppositional to me, and from my view.
Listen, my baby just kicked an agreement, so I think she's on your side with this one. I was like, what are you doing? She's like kicking away right now. But yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think those are important considerations for us to keep in mind, especially as we move forward. And especially, this is going to be I can already tell this is going to be a really ugly campaign season. People need to keep their wits about them. People need to continue to dissent. People need to continue to bring up issues. And regardless of where you fall in this kind of like endless war of, I don't know, like whatever we define as progressivism in the United States. I mean, I just hope that people continue to move left and recognize that presidential politics, electoral politics in general, and the candidates themselves are not the end all be all of what we're trying to do as like a collective, right, with leftist intentions. And I think sometimes, there's a really constantly raging debate about whether voting is worth it or not. I think it is, but that doesn't mean that I disrespect those who choose not to vote for whatever reason. I understand that, there's a degree of frustration and disillusionment with the government and what it does, and how it also like weaponizes voting, and fill in the blank. There are all sorts of like really valid reasons why people choose not to vote. So I don't disrespect that. But I do think that whatever your method of challenging the system, questioning the system, even cooperating with the system in hopes of changing it, whatever that may be, I respect it. And I think that people have to really embrace that we're all going to have different methods of doing this and trying to enact change. And I think in light of how I can already tell how ugly it's going to be, I just really hope that, like, I don't know, I hope that people find the humanity within themselves and others to like recognize that the prize here, the main focus should be getting these basic needs met and accomplishments met by any means necessary. And, be it healthcare or voters' rights or environmental stuff or like so many other rights and things that people have been fighting for a very long time. I just think that sometimes people lose focus on the issues when they get so wrapped up in the candidates themselves and the drama and fighting about that. Like, if you want to come into my timeline and defend one candidate or another that I'm critical of, that's fine, but recognize that like that's not where my focus is, and I really don't care which candidate you stand over another. It's not relevant to me. What's relevant to me is making sure that the issues we need to have addressed are addressed. And If you're in favor of one candidate that I'm not, that's your business. But you coming to complain to me about my feelings on whatever is not necessarily going to push, like, it's not going to move the needle on the issues. It's just you venting, which well too. But I've said over and over, like, I'm not getting involved with the Bernie and Warren drama. I have my feelings on Warren. I have my feelings on Bernie. I express, like, just I express grievances about both of their campaigns, about both of them as people. And I mainly express those grievances when I feel like they are failing to prioritize the issues that we need to have addressed, right? Like, that's when I say something. I don't care about them as people. They're not my mother, father, relative. I don't give a shit. Like, I don't care about them as people. It's not Amo Bernie for me, right? He's not my uncle, my cousin, nor does Elizabeth Warren. So it's not personal for me. It's about making sure that the issues we need to have addressed are addressed, and properly so, and done in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind. And, I think that they both fail at that sometimes, and I'm going to say it. If you have a problem with it, just know that your focus is, in my opinion, in the wrong place, because you're focusing on the person and the cult of personality around that person, and not about the people, because that's where your focus needs to be. Yeah, sorry. Just like, I get angry about it because I'm like, this is so petty and stupid, and like, I don't know, like, we're without freaking healthcare and you're fighting about stupid stuff, it just feels really it feels disproportionate, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, like, there is some selfish motivation for my from my perspective in general, for me personally, but the selfishness is in, like, not being able to, or not wanting to, or desiring to have on my conscience the weight of what I like our political system is doing. And so the only way I can do that is by fighting with every ounce that I can summon. And so that's what I do. And I don't feel like it's always enough, or that it's going to make all the difference or anything like that. But it's the only way that I can continue to, to exist in this system, is to know that I'm doing what I can to undermine the most horrific aspects of it, and where I can and how I can, and recognize when I'm failing, and if I can't correct it immediately, at least try to address it in a way that is in line with the underlying beliefs. And so it's a selfish motivation, but it's for the considerations of all the people around me. I don't want to see anyone suffer. And so, like, because I know what suffering feels like for me, and even if it's not the same suffering as other people that go through for a variety of reasons, and I know that there's a pathway that could lead me towards relative comfort within the system that sacrifices all those people, and there's a pathway that leads to lots of discomfort within the system, but doesn't just openly and willingly sacrifice those people, even if it fails to provide the type of sanctuary that I think we all deserve. It's the righteous course, in my view, and so that's where I go. And so, like, I agree with you. There's a lot of people are going to find different pathways there, but the central focus is not the individual representatives that become cults of personality in one way or another, but the issues and the humanity of all the people that are suffering under a system that generates trillions of dollars worth of value, yet can't seem to feed, clothe, shelter, and provide basic medical care for the people that are providing all of that generated wealth by doing the laborious work it takes to generate, create, and distribute it. And so it's like, we've got to do better, and we can do better. We just have to genuinely work towards it in a way that sacrifices some things that we've come accustomed to, that were built off the exploitation of the people that we want to I guess the word I'm looking for is join in their liberation.
I agree 100%. Well, Richard, thank you so much, as per usual, for speaking with me about your thoughts on the debate, and just your thoughts in general, your philosophical and political thoughts, and where we kind of go from here. I look forward to having these discussions with you later, of course, as the campaign ramps up, or the election ramps up. And then also, obviously, we're going to continue to have our discussions for as long as I can, at least, for Reading Revolution, and for our basic interviews with activists and academics about Histories of Leftists of Color. As per usual, you can find both of us online, but you can definitely find the project by going on Twitter, Facebook, whatever social media platform you use, and searching for LeftPOC, and that's LeftPOC. Depending on time and my energy, or like the availability of guests, we're going to continue to have this discussion about the 2020 race, because both of us recognize its importance, not just for Americans, but also like America's place in the world and what that looks like. Again, kind of measuring it based on the best of the worst, but and hoping for something that is that's change making instead of keeping the status quo. The other thing I should mention too is just, if you have a chance, make sure that you check out the other episodes of the podcast, share, like, subscribe, tell a friend, tell a family member, tell a colleague to check us out. Continue your support through whatever means it may manifest. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for hanging on with us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Ron.